Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for people to get situated from the waiting room. Hey, Ruth, I'm going to, after the introduction, I'm going to just turn this over to you to introduce the presenters today. Is that all right?
Yes, that works. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we might as well get started. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this board workshop regarding the SSJD Assessment District Feasibility Study to order. For the record, my name is Bill Edgar. I'm the president of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And on behalf of the board, I'd like to thank you for logging in and phoning in today. We appreciate your time. I know it's valuable and you'd rather be somewhere else, I'm sure, but in any event, thanks for logging in. This telephone conference constitutes the board's workshop meeting for the month of July 2021. For those who have read the agenda already, you will notice that the staff has put together a rather extensive list of instructions, which are part of the printed agenda for this workshop. We've gone over these before, so we don't need to do that again, I don't think. Suffice to say, if you're having problems logging in or accessing this meeting, please call or email or text Ryan Jones, our board clerk, or Leslie Gallagher, and they'd be happy to help you. Now, regarding the meeting process itself, I think the way we've run the meeting before has generally been okay, so we're going to do that again. That is, Ryan Jones will be monitoring these proceedings from a technical point of view, and he will operate the slides for today's presentations and presenters, I believe. He, as well as Leslie and Michael Wright and other staff members, will field comments and questions addressed to the presenters, either from text or emails that you send, or if you raise your hand in the chat function, we will address those comments on a first come, first come basis. Second, you'll notice that there is essentially one substantive item of this morning, the SSJD Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage District Assessment District Feasibility Study, which constitutes the primary purpose of today's meeting and workshop. And specifically, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the preliminary results of the analysis the staff has done for determining the feasibility of an assessment to fund Category 1 services. And those Category 1 services are the services that leverage beneficiaries beyond the boundary limits of the district. So we'll be talking about that a little bit today and whether or not we can meet the requirements of the law regarding special benefits for those properties. Scott Brown of our consulting team and Kim Floyd will be taking the lead on the presentations this morning. However, Ruth Darling probably has some introductory comments, and I'll be she'll be taking the lead and introducing the presenters. Regarding the comments, we intend to ask for questions from the board first, and then unmute for the public, and give those speakers on a first come, first served basis an opportunity to speak. After we've completed the public questions and comments, we'll bring it back to the board. There's no action today since this is a workshop. But at least we'll try to be a little bit more informal today since this is a workshop. And we'll handle this a little more informally than we do our regular board meeting. You should be aware that this meeting is being recorded and will be housed on our website just as our streaming video has for all of our meetings. We'll be taking breaks along the way, and I'll probably interrupt the presenters at an appropriate time to allow that to happen. And then Ryan will place a sign on the screen that will indicate that we are on break and the time will be coming back. So I'm under to item number 1, which is the introductions and announcements at this time. Leslie, do you have any other announcements you want to make at this time?
I do not. The agenda is all in order, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Members, we're now on item 2 on the agenda, which is the roll call. And Ryan, if you wouldn't mind, please call the roll to determine if we have a full board today.
Board Member Griego.
Here.
Board Member Johnson.
Good morning. I'm here.
Board Member Ramirez.
Morning. Here.
Board Member Valines.
Here.
Board Member Countryman.
Present.
Vice President Dolan.
Good morning, I'm here.
President Edgar.
Thank you, Ryan. We have a full board this morning. All members are present. We're now on item number 3, which is public comments. Leslie or Ryan, do you see any comments from the public that we need to take at this time?
I don't have anything here.
I don't see anything either, President Edgar.
Okay, thank you. Let's then proceed to item 4 on the agenda, which is, as I stated before, we're going to turn this meeting over to Ruth Darling, who's going to introduce this item and moderate today's presentation. We're going to be talking in depth about the work that's being done thus far on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District Assessment District Feasibility Study. And we'll specifically be talking about the benefit, special benefit that we can legally place on properties not necessarily within the area, but that will have benefit for any assessment that is derived. This is important because basically we're trying to generate funds for the rural areas to improve their flood protection. Those are the areas that are lacking funding at this point, and we're trying to find a way to perhaps increase their ability to fund their improvements. Okay, Ruth, why don't we just proceed with you making the introduction to the program.
Great. Thank you, President Edgar. Ryan, would you mind pulling up the PowerPoint?
Yes, one moment, please.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, as Bill had mentioned, my name is Ruth Darling. I'm a program manager with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. So I'm the lead for the board on the SSJDD Assessment District Feasibility Study efforts. Today, we have several presenters that will help describe the feasibility study and the background, the intent, sort of where we're at today and why we're here. Some of you may recall there's five categories that the feasibility study is looking at, and as Bill had mentioned, today is specifically focused on category 1, so services that leverage beneficiaries beyond the boundary limits of the local maintaining agencies. So After I do our introduction, we are going to have Laura Bird with Jacobs Engineering provide our background information. We'll have a Scott Brown take a deeper dive into the SSJDD current authorities and the legal analysis that's been done currently. We'll have Kim Floyd provide an overview on the stakeholder outreach, and then Joanna Liu from HDR and Scott will take a deeper dive into the methodology of the services, beneficiary analysis, and the results. So next slide, please, Ryan. Ooh, back, there you go, thank you. Okay, so the presentation is quite dense. I think it will probably take in the neighborhood of 2 hours, including the presentation itself, as well as question and answers. It's quite a bit of information, so we have breaks for questions, but please feel free to ask questions if you have them. We want to make sure everyone is understanding the concepts that we're presenting here today, so please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, interrupt us if you need. So we will review background and the objective of the feasibility study. We'll provide a summary of the stakeholder engagement thus far. We'll review the categories of service to be evaluated in this study and provide an overview of Category 1 services and approach to the beneficiary analysis. We'll describe the flood risk analysis approach and present preliminary results of the beneficiary analysis and assessment methodology. And we'll provide a summary of stakeholder feedback, what we've heard from our several stakeholder meetings, and we will review the study schedule and the next steps. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura Bird.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes,
Awesome.
Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, President Egger and members of the board. Thank you for having me today. I wanted to give just a short kind of refresher of kind of the background of the SSJDD and how it came into our planning process here. You've seen many of these slides before, so this is just kind of a reminder, and then we'll dive into some of the other content that Ruth just went over. So as you all are familiar, the 2017 update recommended $17 to $21 billion for capital and ongoing needs over the next 30 years. And this update brought together technical and policy level discussions and actions that make up that 17 to 21 billion. And this board adopted it in 2017, and the Department of Water Resources is currently working on the 2022 update to that plan with refinements on the needed capital and ongoing investment. So next slide, please. Okay, so this broke down into the two categories, ongoing and capital. You can see there's an annual funding amount of $250 to $310 million per year, looking for all ongoing investments. That does include operation and maintenance, emergency management, floodplain risk management, other types of ongoing activities that we do on an annual basis. And then the capital investment is separate. It's for one-time construction or larger improvements, and that's $12 to $16 billion over the 30-year period. So we put these two pieces together, and we're gonna break them out separately here in just a minute. So next slide, please. Okay, so for ongoing investments, the $350 to $210 million per year across the 30-year period. In 2017, so these are numbers as of 2017's update, we were currently spending about $117, $120 million per year on those types of activities that are listed to the left. So emergency management, reservoir operations, routine O&M, risk awareness campaigns, and things of that nature. And the plan at the end of the 30-year period, so at the end of phase 3, was recommending to be at $310 million per year. So that's the bar on the right-hand side of the bar chart. And so there's a considerable amount of gap that would need to be addressed to be able to get to that point. So the investment strategy looked at ways that could potentially fund this gap. So you see that there's state, federal, and local sources that all contribute to both the current need and then the proposed phase 3 need. Next slide. And then similarly for capital investments, we looked at, a variety of sources, a variety of projects that were proposed in the basin-wide feasibility studies with our partners at the Corps and with the RFMPs as well, and have a collection of several projects that make this $12 to $16 billion over 30 years of improvements that need to be included in the CVFPB. And so similarly, on the left-hand side, there was a current level of expenditure from 2017 that was about $4 billion. And then at the end of the 30-year period, all phases would be between the 12 to 16. So that's on the right-hand side. And so you can see an additional gap there from a capital perspective that would need to be addressed if we're going to accomplish everything we've set out to. And again, state, federal, and local sources are a part of both. Next slide, please. So to address that gap, the investment strategy from 2017 proposed several new and existing potential funding sources that could address that gap. The new sources are included there at the bottom, one of which was the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District, another was the River Basin Assessment, and the last one was the State Flood Insurance Program. And we have federal and local sources included there as well, of course, and the drainage district itself, in the investment strategy, we had proposed a potentially $25 million per year revenue from that source if it was found feasible and it was established. So it kind of is what started this process of reutilizing the district and investigating if this is feasible. So next slide, please. And so just to kind of zoom in on the state sources specifically, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you'll see the current funding level that was presented in the 2017 update on an average annual basis from 2006 to 2015 as far as the time period. And on the right-hand side column, you'll see what the recommended funding level would have been by the end of the 30-year period. So general fund and general obligation bonds, those are primary sources that come from the state. There's $40 million per year on an average basis that we receive from the general fund for Central Valley flood management activities. We're recommending in the 2017 update to increase that to $190 million per year annually. And then similarly with general obligation bonds, on an average basis, we see, at least in this time period between 2006 and 2015, 180 million per year, and we're looking at increasing that to the $2.5 billion per decade. So basically one large bond per decade over the 30-year period. So that would include the 3 decades. And with the new sources, of course, they're not established yet, so there's no current funding level, but in the recommended plan, the funding level by the end of the 30-year period is $25 million per year for the San Joaquin Drainage District, $25 per year for the River Basin Assessment that's currently not established, and then the State Flood Insurance Program, which is $12 million per year. So we're really focusing on the Drainage District this morning, and we are hoping to pull any of the findings that come out of this feasibility study back into the CVFPB and then the investment strategy content for the 2022 update, and refining exactly what this team deems as feasible or not, and if this $25 million per year is something that we can continue to pull forward with the investment strategy, or if we need to update that. So I think with that, I can hand it off to Mr. Scott Brown.
Laura, I think it might be helpful to ask the board if there are any questions at this point. This seems like a good break point to zero in on there. Do we have any questions from the board members at this point? Guess not. Okay, thank you.
Mr. President, Jane here.
Oh, yep, Jane.
Thank you. It would be helpful to me if, as this is presented, if there was an indication that this information has also been presented at any stakeholder meetings.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this similar slide deck was presented about a year ago when we started the engagement process, and then we've been reminding our stakeholders of the similar types of messages throughout this last spring. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay, Ryan, do you? I don't seem to have control here.
Yes, one moment, please, Scott.
No worries.
Okay, we should be good now.
There we go. Have it now. Maybe. Make sure I'm on. There we go. Okay. Good morning, President Egger and members of the board. Again, my name is Scott Brown with Larson Rizal Associates. Next set of slides, just some additional background again on the Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage District and how we're viewing that authority within this feasibility study. So again, the district was established in 1913 for the purpose of constructing and maintaining facilities directed for collection of assessments associated with those facilities and authorized acquisition of land and rights of way. Its existing authority is established in the Water Code beginning in Section 8750. It allows for the levy of assessments on lands within the drainage district as well as lands adjacent that benefit. That assessment must be apportioned according to the benefit provided by the district, and the assessment could be proportional to the entire endeavor, what the language says, meaning all projects taken on by the district, or it can be defined on a project by project basis, which is how the assessments were rolled out. It does require written consent of landowners, at least 2/3 of landowners consent, and that's either 2/3 by lands in terms of acreage or by land value. And that in today's world of legal requirements, it is governed by Prop 13. And we wanted to point out that it's separate from Prop 218, which is for local agencies and their assessment authorities, as well as Prop 26, which is procedural requirements for imposition of taxes. We asked the attorney on our team to do a little bit of research for us up front on a couple of items that I'm just going to go over quickly with you as a reminder. We have presented this before, so this should hopefully just be a refresher for you. The first item that we looked at, we asked for his opinion on how Proposition 26 would affect any decisions to amend the SSJDD authority and statutes. And so Prop 26 restricts an imposition of charges by the state by a 2/3 vote of legislature. And so the finding was that amending the water code to alter any procedural rules would change the authorization, but not result in a direct imposition of an assessment. So those requires would not, the requirement for a 2/3 vote did not apply in this instance. And then further, the Proposition 26 requires or allows for reasonable charges for benefits and services. It provides exemptions from the 2/3 approval rule for specific benefit or government services, so long as those charges do not exceed reasonable cost for the benefit or service. And so the conclusions were that Prop 26 does not restrict state authorization of charges should the board decide to move forward with any changes in the authorization. It allows for exemptions of benefits and services. So regardless of how flood control services or flood control activities were viewed in the court, they would be allowed so long as they do not exceed reasonable cost. And so in the end, the opinion was that any proposed amendment that we would put forward for consideration of Water Code 8784, which is the authority to assess under the SSJDD, that would not require a 2/3 legislative approval, which we felt would be a high hurdle. So it would follow a normal approval process. The second question we asked was how the SSJDD authority relates to 8361 facilities. And again, 8361, the Water Code, outlines specific elements of the Sacramento River flood control system, and states that the department shall maintain and operate those units, and that the cost of those of maintenance and operation will be defrayed by the state. It also provides that local agencies would be responsible for any of the project works within its boundaries, except for those that are identified in 8361. So the conclusion was that the SSJDD assessment could not be used to fund any operations and maintenance activities for facilities within 8361. But because the statutes were specific with regard to maintenance and operation, the opinion was that an SSJDD assessment could fund any capital improvements that were required to 8361 facilities. So that is the two items of legal importance to date. As we'll cover later in the slides, we'll be advancing other activities with regards to any proposed amendment and findings regarding the moving forward with any recommendations for feasibility. So I think I can stop here before I move on. Were there any questions on the two legal items that we had researched? Okay. All right, hearing none, I will move on. So the study objectives, I think I'm covering this. So the study objectives really are to evaluate the feasibility of an assessment and whether that could provide the funding levels to that was identified in the investment strategy. And then if those are feasible, develop an implementation plan that the board could have to advance any future assessments. We outlined several elements of feasibility testing that we felt were important. Of utmost importance was stakeholder buy-in, knowing that there will be some level of landowner approval. We felt that was the primary feasibility test. Any funds generated should supplement and not compete with existing funding sources, so no replacements. It should be affordable. It should provide sufficient return on investment, meaning that the assessment revenue should be substantial enough not to be sort of diluted down by the administrative cost to impose the assessment and administer the assessment. Of course, it needs to be politically legally possible, and there must be a path forward for implementation. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Kim Floyd to discuss our stakeholder engagement.
Good morning, President Edgar and board members. So just a reminder that our approach is very heavy on stakeholder engagement. As Scott stated in the last slide, the very first measure of feasibility is stakeholder buy-in. And our approach to stakeholder engagement was to focus on small group efforts, leveraging the work that's already been done by the RFMPs. So we have been organizing our small group stakeholder meetings around the RFMPs. In our first round, we worked to partner with the RFMPs to identify services to be considered in the feasibility study. And then we went back and did a gut check with them before we came to the board. Rounds 2 and 3, we focused on the beneficiary analysis and then the assessment methodology, specifically for service area 1 that you'll see today. Again, every time we develop work product, we go back to these small groups. We meet with them, we take their input, we run that through our process and then go back to them to confirm what we've heard and review changes. So that, will continue to be our focus. And if at the point we get to services that are feasible and we need to bring in other stakeholder groups, we will certainly do that. An example of that would be, for instance, cities and counties, as they'll be the tax collecting entities. Next slide, Scott. So again, we started meeting with stakeholders a year ago now, and this is an iterative process, so it does take time, scheduling meetings, getting their input, going back and doing the gut check, and then coming to the board. So we still have some work to do after we're done talking with you today, so we'll be meeting with them again on this service area, and then as we move forward with developing the methodology for the others. So does anyone have any questions about stakeholder outreach? All right, thank you.
Okay, based on the stakeholder outreach that Kim indicated initially, our question to stakeholders first off was, what services or activities would you think would be appropriate and could be tentatively supported for evaluation in the feasibility study? So as a reminder, I think we presented this in the past, and just to remind everyone, these 5 categories are the services we're evaluating in the study. The first category of services that President Edgar described at the onset, this is the topic of the day. It's the services that leverage beneficiaries beyond the boundaries of individual LMAs to assess for. There are beneficiaries often that fall outside of an LMA's jurisdiction. They receive the benefit, but they just cannot assess them legally because they're beyond their boundaries. So that's the investigation for category 1 that we'll be reviewing today. We also identified from the outreach that there could be services or activities that provide a programmatic or regional corridor benefit. to multiple agencies, and that a single assessment might be more efficient to impose versus individual groups or agencies assessing for a portion of their share and needing to come up with a programmatic approach for the revenue for that service. The third item that was brought to our attention is that capital improvements within state maintenance areas are difficult to fund through the state maintenance area authority, with limitations on how many years they can look out and how they reconcile every year to their budgets. And so the potential for an overlay assessment by the SSJDD authority could provide a longer term assessment that could be more affordable for property owners to fund those capital improvements. And then the last two categories are items that address issues that were identified in the small community flood risk reduction programs. These are rural communities with limited funds and limited property base. And so the fourth category would be to look at a governance solution for bringing multiple small communities together under a single assessment to programmatically implement their small community projects. And then the fifth element had to do with a restriction on use of public funds for improvements on private property. And that comes into play when property owners are attempting to do non-structural flood mitigation, whether it is flood proofing of a commercial building or raising or elevating structures, private residences. They often receive federal funding for this through FEMA, but they're still required to provide about 25% of the cost share of that activity. And so the idea for category 5 is that the SSJDD would be used for a voluntary assessment program similar to the PACE program for clean energy, where a property owner voluntarily assesses themselves and pays for that through their property taxes over time. So those are the 5 categories that we're investigating in the study. And at this point, I think I put a hard break in just to capture any questions or comments that the board may have at this time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, Mary Jane?
On your last slide on category 4, you talk about some type of regional governance that would kind of manage these smaller LMAs. How does that discussion go with the folks that you've been interacting with? How does that look to them?
So the intent here would be, if a small community had a program that they needed to assess for, and they went at it alone, they would have to go through a Prop 218 process, which is pretty costly for a small community, and it would be restricted to just that project, and would have a very small tax base that could pose some limitations on the bond funding issuance. The idea here is that the SSJDD assessment could defray that cost of forming an assessment district to local communities and develop a greater tax base. We'll be working, we haven't advanced this category to the point to have specific conversations with stakeholders yet. We've been focusing on the category 1 service that has had a lot of analysis to work through. So we're over the next month and a half, we'll be developing guidelines for Category 4 and reaching out to stakeholders.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's important to point out, Scott. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the only thing that we've actually really gone over with the stakeholders is Category 1. Isn't that right?
With any sufficient detail, that's correct. We've had discussions of the other categories and on a conceptual basis, and noodled through different ideas of how that might be applied, but we haven't driven down to any specific analysis yet.
Okay. The question I had is kind of getting to Mary Jane's point. We're talking about Category 1 services, those services that essentially leverage beneficiaries beyond the boundaries of the individual LMAs. So we're talking about a kind of a concept that the normal LMAs are not familiar with. They're familiar with what they can assess plus a 218 election and so on. What kind of feedback are we getting on the legal realities of this on these Category 1? Are they understanding that this is really something different than they're used to, or are some of them confused at this point? What's your sense of that?
My sense, and I'll also ask Kim to see what her perception is, but my sense is that they understand the concept of why we are investigating this service. I haven't received any confusing comments about how the process would go, or concerns about the legality of assessing for the beneficiaries beyond. There have been some concerns about whether those beneficiaries would be willing to assess, to vote for an assessment in that case. But as far as the legalities of a larger assessment, I have not heard any concerns or received much question about that. Kim, can you provide any input on that?
I don't know that it's so much legal concern at this point, Bill, with just how we are, how would we assess beneficiaries, or how are we determining the beneficiaries to assess? Where are the boundaries? Who would be impacted? The idea here would be to try to look at how urban areas benefit from, rural maintenance of bypass levees. And in that case, are we really hitting the targeted group? Can we demonstrate that there's benefit there? I think that's the issue we're still grappling with right now, getting that part right. I mean, a lot of these issues, I see a question from Mark List in the chat about whether or not we have looked at how we would distribute funding for work. We're not there yet. We still need to work through and get some consensus with our stakeholders on how we are assessing benefit.
Yeah, that's the concern I have, whether or not they understand that this is a totally different concept than what they're used to.
Oh, I would say yes to that. A
Okay.
resounding yes. And again, we worked with stakeholders to identify these potential categories of services.
Okay.
But so that was not an idea that was done. We did not develop Category 1 in a vacuum. That said, the practical application of how you assess benefit is a different story. So that's again what we're trying to work through now.
Mm-hmm. Well, are we beginning to talk about that in terms of depth of flooding and so on?
Well, yeah, and you'll hear today exactly what we've already discussed
Okay.
with stakeholders, and then again, we have more work to do, so this is not a done deal today by any stretch.
Yeah, sure. I'm just I'm just trying to understand that they're beginning to understand the concept we're talking about here. Basically, what we're trying to do is.
Yeah, I hate to speak for them, but in my experience, we're working with the experts at the local level and on all counts, and they're really partners with us in this process, and I think they understand better than most.
Okay.
Yeah, that this is different.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kim.
Through the chair,
Yeah, Mary Jane.
just to kind of follow up on some of your discussion with Kim is the SSJDD assessment district, going through that, working through that vein right there eliminates the Prop 218 requirements that the locals are used to. But does it also alleviate any requirements such as LAFCO? And also when you're looking at different counties, how do you, are you working with the treasurers, or
So
the assessors, I should say?
So Mary Jane, if I might, we would approach counties and cities at the point we determined there was feasibility and we needed to work through the process of how we would actually implement. We're not there yet. But in terms of the Prop 218 process, this would still require a property owner vote, much like a Prop 218 process, and it can't be imposed like a state maintenance area, for example. There is still a vote requirement. Right now, it actually requires a 2/3 vote for approval, which is a higher threshold than Prop 218. So our idea was that, because, people understand and we're used to, and property owners are used to the Prop 218 process, we would look at something similar. But this wouldn't be something, again, that the board would just unilaterally impose. It would have to be a partnership with locals.
And what about the LAFCO process? Is that still part of the process that they'd have to go through?
I'm going to ask Scott. My
No,
sense is no. Right.
Yeah, no, the LAFCO process is not relevant here, Mary Jane. We're not talking about annexation or changing boundaries or anything like that. This is just an assessment to existing boundaries.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and I think that the LAFCO is, governs local agencies within the county, and is a state agency. I don't believe you would be subject to LAFCO. But as Kim mentioned, we're testing feasibility here. We get to the point where we're determining feasibility for certain categories. We'll be developing an implementation plan, and part of that plan is identifying how to interact procedurally with counties, cities, and eventually LAFCO.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right. So we're going to start diving in now over the next series of slides to really look at the efforts that we've undertaken for Category 1. Is that me? Why that did that? So again, Category 1, we're going to be going through an overview of the approach, of how we defined benefit, and the methodology that we developed. We'll review how we're calculating flood damage and using that as a metric for benefit. And then we have run through 2 example situations that we'll review what the preliminary results would be if we were to apply that beneficiary analysis and assessment methodology. So for Category 1, The service we're looking at is operations and maintenance of the Sutter bypass and Yellow bypass levees. Current limitations, as we've stated, that the LMAs along the bypass that maintain those levees can only assess properties within their jurisdiction, and that there are other properties that benefit from reduced flows on the mainstream river that do not contribute to operations and maintenance directly, namely the urban areas of Sacramento and some of the rural communities along the Sacramento River. So our objective was to quantify benefits to properties protected by the bypass system. So those properties that are behind the levee. Also to quantify benefit to properties due to the reduced flood risk as a result of the bypass operation. Combine those benefits and develop a methodology to assess all properties based on the cumulative benefits of both conditions. So in our approach, we had to define what benefit is, if we're going to quantify it, make sure we define it correctly, and use these terms consistently. So we defined an existing benefit as the risk of flood damage resulting from failure of bypass levees. So this is flood damages to properties directly protected by bypass levees. We defined incremental benefit as additional risk of flood damages that would occur from increased flows in the main stem if the bypass system were not in operation. So for those areas where they receive a benefit from operations, we're looking at just the incremental damages above the system in operate. And then we define combined benefit is just the sum of those two. Our assessment methodology apportions cost of operations and maintenance of the bypass levees to all properties based on the combined benefit. So this is very similar approach that would be used by a local agency in a 218 process. So our stakeholders were familiar with the approach. And then the other item in the methodology is to be sure to provide a credit that accounts for the local maintaining agencies that are actually performing work, some of which is already being assessed onto properties within their district. So this is just an overview. We'll be diving into more detail on all this as we move forward. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Joanna Liu. Joanna's group did all of the flood risk modeling to help us quantify the benefits. So she'll be walking through her approach for the flood risk assessment.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, President Egger and members of the board. Thanks for having me today. Scott mentioned I'm a senior water resources engineer with HDR, and our focus was really on computing flood damages for the different scenarios we were looking at under Category 1. I wanted to start sort of at a high level talking about flood risk. We've already thrown around a lot of different terminology with flood risk and damages and benefits, and just wanted to start with our standard flood risk assessment approach, which is really a standard of practice as we embark on these types of studies. The different components that we evaluate, and this is in a spatial context within a watershed, include the hydrology, if you see up at the top right of the screen, essentially how much precipitation is falling into the watershed, draining into our reservoirs, We have the power to operate these reservoirs such that we minimize the risk downstream. Those flows coming out of our reservoir systems are then routed through the channel. Most of our levees within the Central Valley are levied, and so we have to take into account the geotechnical aspects of those levees. As we know, many areas have deficiencies and a likely or high probability of failure, different modes of failure due to seepage, through seepage, under seepage, and even overtopping. So this is all taken into account within the flood risk assessment. The hydraulics are captured with modeling as well, so we can determine with the amount of flow coming down the stream how high the channel stage is going to get. And with that channel stage, we can then estimate the likelihood of that levee failing. If a levee did fail, then there's a certain volume of flow that would come through that levee breach and inundate the floodplain. And so we capture the damageable property within that floodplain. For Category 1, we really focused on structural and crop damage. And so we have an inventory to capture all of that as far as structure value and crop value. So all of these pieces combined gets us to what we're calling flood risk or flood damage in terms of dollars. Next slide. So as I said, this is really the state of practice for any type of large system analysis, especially here in a levied system. So we're taking the sort of spatial mapping cartoon concept and now translating that into the technical approach that we followed. And so this is our circular diagram of risk analysis and all the pieces that we translate from the map I just was talking about to really the analysis and the numbers and how we crunch those to get to the ultimate dollar damage. So I'll just start up at the top left of the diagram. Luckily, as we sit here today, we are able to leverage a lot of work that was done through various programs that the department and the board has helped promote. So starting with the Central Valley Hydrology Study, we have an array of historical events that have been captured and scaled and used in this type of analysis. It incorporates the regulation of the reservoirs, as I was saying. If we continue over to the top right in a clockwise fashion, the CVFPB program developed hydraulic modeling throughout the Central Valley. So we had those models to use for this as well. If we continue around the circle for the geotechnical components, the Uli Nuli program really took evaluations of our levee system throughout, and so based on borings and other geotechnical information, levee fragility curves or levee performance curves were developed throughout the Central Valley, and so those were available to us for this project as well. And so all of it really comes together down at the bottom left-hand part of the slide under the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. We've pulled all of this together to come to the consequence part of our circle here, which really is the probability of a likely or flood event happening. What would the consequence be, or what would the dollar damage be? And so this is how all the pieces sort of fit together in our risk analysis. Next slide. So specifically for Category 1, for the Sutter and Yolo bypasses, as we've mentioned before, that the LMAs near the Sutter or Yolo bypass maintain levees to pass flood flows diverted from the Sacramento River, really to reduce flooding to urban areas in and around the Sacramento region. So these bypasses are large facilities that can convey high volumes of flow during a high flood event and really reduce the risk to those urban communities. The responsibility really is for the LMAs to maintain those levees within their local jurisdiction. And so the benefits would be those LMAs, obviously the urban areas downstream where the flow is getting routed around, But those areas are outside of each of those individual LMA's jurisdictions. The benefit to having these bypasses in place, obviously, is that they're able to handle these large flow volumes during high flood events. So to the right, there's a map here showing really the outlying orange boundaries are impact areas, what we refer to as the study areas, that we're also looking at through the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. We selected a number of the impact areas for purposes of this study that were near the bypasses or areas that we thought would show a benefit for having these operation of the bypasses in place. So those areas are shown shaded in green. Those areas are that we included for category 1. Next slide. So for our methodology, we started with estimating flood damages. And so for all the areas that were shaded in green there, we included in our flood damage assessment. We computed flood damage for what we're calling an existing condition, or really the existing physical state of the system as it stands today. So with the levees on the bypasses and operation of those bypasses in place. We then looked at the system without the bypasses in operation. So essentially, if we turned off any flow entering into the bypass, what would that look like? How do damages now change? Inevitably, if the bypasses weren't there, more flow would be routed down the Sacramento River and larger damage would occur. So we evaluated both of those situations by calculating what we call expected annual damage. This captures not just a single flood event, but incorporates all flood events. So a small flood event, a very large flood event, and it's really an average over time that gives you an expected annual damage. So it's the damage that you could expect to see within any given year. This is a process and methodology that's been followed many times, not just for projects here in the Central Valley, but nationwide. It really follows core and DWR standards for flood risk analysis. We did, however, I just wanted to note, simplify the methodology somewhat. It's similar to the 2022 update methodology, but due to some schedule constraints and limitations, we only simulated a number of high flow events and not, I think there's 100-something different flows that we are using for the CVFPB. HDR is also involved in doing that side of the analysis, but we simplified it here mostly due to the feasibility level of this analysis so far. I think if the board were to decide to move this forward, that we would likely revert back to the full flow simulations and analysis to be consistent with what we've done for CVFPB. Next slide. So just going a little bit deeper into the methodology for existing damage, again, that is damages resulting from high flow events under the physical state of the system as we see it today. We were able to leverage the existing CVFED hydraulic models. Those are HEC RAS models that have been fully reviewed and vetted through various studies. So we took those pretty much off the shelf and simulated high flow events through those. We were also able to utilize the 2022 update. We call them HEC FDA models that are really the models that compute the damage. And within those, it incorporates a pretty large effort to update the inventory. So through the 2022 update, there will be included a structure inventory as of 2019. For the incremental damage component, and then again, this is the expected flood damage without the bypass, or the additional damage without the bypass operation, we took that same CVFED model and essentially created a without bypass geometry. I'll get into a little more detail on how we did that here in the next few slides, but that's what we did. We essentially took the bypasses out of flow delivery. So we calculated flood damage also for this without bypass condition, and then the incremental damage would be then just the difference between the without bypass operation geometry and the existing. Next slide. So just wanted to touch on, these are the study areas that we showed in the previous slides in the green here on the left. These are the impact areas that we included in the flood damage computations. Just wanted to note that the CVFED flow routing model that's over on the right side is a system model. So it does incorporate channels, you know, not just the Sacramento River, but also the Feather and all the tributaries as well. So the channel hydraulics are system based. So for the existing condition geometry, just wanted to point out how flow enters into the Sutter and Yellow bypasses. So currently configured in the model, we have flow coming in up near the Butte Sink area, looking at the map on the left. Flow also enters off the Sacramento River through the Moulton, Colusa, and Tisdale Weir. The way that the weirs are configured is shown there at the bottom left of the figure with the gray. You can see if you're looking at it, if you were to be facing the diversion, flow is allowed to come in through the weir there where it's a little bit lower in elevation. If I had a pointer, I could do that. Maybe you could point that out, Scott. Thank you. And then the outlets down at the downstream end were allowed to flow between the bypasses and the rivers just as it operates today. The bypass levees were in place and would contain flow, you know, up to a certain level. Throughout the system model, there are prescribed levee breaches. So if the channel stage gets to a certain elevation, the levee would break and flow would be allowed to escape out into the floodplain. This is a common assumption that has been adopted for the system-wide modeling in the Central Valley. If I point your direct attention to the map on the right, as we come into the Yolo bypass, up at the top end of the photo, where the Feather River comes in, there is a portion of the channel that's within the entrance to the Yolo bypass. Currently, it's allowed to spill out over into the Sutter bypass at the downstream end. There is the Fremont Weir there where flow comes into the Yolo bypass, and then the Sacramento Weir there is down at the bottom right. So those flows come off the Sacramento River into the Yolo bypass. So this is how the configuration is set up for our existing condition, meant to represent what's out there today. Next slide. So we came to the point where we had to make an assumption as to what the system might look like if we were to take the bypasses out of operation. And so to be able to do that with our hydraulic routing model, we, as I said, turned off all of the valves, if you will, for places where flow could enter. And so of the weirs that we pointed out on the last slide, the Moulton, Colusa, and Tisdale weir, we raised those weirs, again, down at the bottom left, such that they were adjacent to the levee elevations nearby. So that would just prevent that low space for flow to get in. Where the Butte Sink area comes in, we raised those levees to essentially cut off any flow coming in at the upstream end of the Sutter bypass. If we shift attention over to the right side, where I was mentioning the Feather River is allowed to go into the Sutter bypass at the downstream end, we raised those levees along the Feather River such that it would maintain flow within the channelized portion instead of letting it go out into the Sutter bypass. Again, we raised the Fremont weir and the Sacramento weir. We turned off just so flow wasn't able to get in to the Yolo bypass. The same levee triggers, breach triggers were maintained. So if the channel stage got to a certain elevation, flow was allowed to leave the channel. I think I covered everything there. Okay, thanks. So with all that, we estimated flood damages for the existing condition and the without bypass and operation condition. And so you'll see on the left the impact areas that we included in the analysis. This is expected annual damage in thousands of dollars for each of these areas. This is the existing state of the system. If we look at the without bypass flood damage, you'll notice that several areas turn from green to yellow, orange, or red, and that's really due to loss of this large flood conveyance down the bypasses. So if those were turned off, most or all the flow is now forced to be routed down the main channels of the rivers. So areas adjacent to those rivers, you'll see higher damage. I will stop here for any questions. It's really the end of the flood damage analysis. I think in the following slides, Scott's going to go into how we took the flood damage estimates and translated that to beneficiaries and ultimately the assessments.
Okay, so we'll open it up to questions here.
I have a question.
Yeah, this is Jane. I do too.
Joe?
I just wonder about this premise of shutting off the flows to the bypass. The system was designed to have flow in the river and in the bypass. So wouldn't it seems to me it'd be like more logical to say just remove all the levees rather than try to force into all the water into the main channel that was never designed to handle. So it's a little confusing to me. The other thing I'm wondering about is the fragility curves or the failure triggers for the levees. Where did you get that information from?
So there's actually, I should separate the two. So there's potential triggers within the hydraulic model that have been set throughout the system. These are consistent with what was used for the CVFPB in 2017. And it's really meant to address the upstream levee failure assumptions. So that's one set of levee conditions. On a parallel path for flood damages, say for a particular impact area, there is a levee fragility curve that's assigned to a levee reach. And so that's more specific to how we compute the flood damages. So they're included in both sets of modeling, but one is just a trigger elevation in the channel for the RAS modeling, and the other is the actual levee performance curve used in the damage computation, if that makes sense.
Wow. And the fragility curves are determined by how or who?
So in 2017, URS was working on that with the department, utilizing the Uli-Nuli information. So for every impact area that you saw on one of the slides that was in bordered in orange, there was an estimate made based on that geotechnical data to determine different probabilities of failure for different channel stages. I'm probably not the right person to describe how those were developed, but AECOM, yeah, AECOM now that was URS before, for the 2022 update, we took a fresh look at that and looked at how if levee conditions had changed since 2017, like if a new project came online, for example, new fragility curves were developed to represent a more robust levee if that were the case. Yeah, some of that information will be updated in the 2022 update.
So I would assume that the levees and without the bypasses, that the levees failed very, very frequently, regardless of what the fragility number was.
Right.
Because the water's going over the top of the levee, so we know it can't possibly do that.
Yes, I would say yes. I mean, as you can imagine, if you take the bypasses offline, that flow pretty much goes everywhere. So
it's almost the same as what I was saying, remove the levee because
yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-huh. Yes,
Jane, I
Jane
think you
has
had a question.
I do. It looks to, this is just for me to understand your maps and diagrams. It looks to me like this map diagram creates some geology, or maybe these are legal boundaries. So that would be my first question. How did these segments get identified to be mapped? And then what
way they
does SA with a number relate to? Because it doesn't look like it's sequential, so.
Oh, yes.
It must relate to some subset of data. So what is it?
Sure. So we're calling these impact areas, and I would say that the boundaries of each of these goes back to the Corps' comprehensive study, which were identified in the early 2000s based on a floodplain inundation mapping. Those have been carried forward through various Central Valley studies. And so you'll notice that, the boundaries on the outside are irregular, and that follows that floodplain boundary that was developed, a long time ago. Within those is the inventory that I was describing. So we capture all the structures and crops within a particular impact area. And the impact areas also are developed, like say the southern boundary of the one at the top right is probably from a physical stoppage of flow. So like a railroad or some feature that would prevent flow from continuing downstream. And so it's really meant to capture an area that would have homogeneous type flooding within that boundary. Again, these are areas that have been used for several studies, 2022 update included. And the naming convention, there's no real rhyme or reason to the numbering. It's just, I think, 1 to 63 for Sacramento.
Okay. All right. So this goes back to the comp study and CVFPB and all of that. So
yeah.
Didn't recreate. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions?
Okay.
President Egger, this is Rick Reinhardt. I have a question and a comment, or more of a comment. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers on behalf of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. First, I want to thank the board staff, and the study team for having such an inclusive process for working with the stakeholders to develop this incrementally to build broad support for the work you're doing. I was going to hold this comment until Scott spoke, but Joe's question, I think, is relevant and important. But Joe, I came to a different conclusion than you just did. That, as I understand it, all the urban levees, the fragility curves are based on implementation of all the authorized projects. As the board knows, these are considered early implementation projects for the CVFPB. And so we have this system that's in a state of implementation that results in the urban levees having very high levels of performance, whereas the rural levees have very low levels of performance. And as you'll see in the next presentation with Scott, what ends up happening is there's a I'll say from some of the members of the association's perspective, a disproportionate allocation of the benefits of the system. Because the rural levies are so poor, they're picking up a lot more of the costs than we had anticipated they would. And we've talked with the study team about this. I know the study team's working on it, but because you had raised this issue, I thought it was worth highlighting that a little bit as something that's ongoing, and you'll see in the next presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Scott, if you don't mind, I think this would be, unless there are any questions on the information that's been presented so far, I'd like to call a 15-minute break if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
Okay, Ryan, let's make this for 15 minutes, please. Thank you. Okay, it's 11:38, so we're back in session. Ryan, you okay with that?
That works for me, President Edgar. I'll bring up the presentation now.
Okay. Scott, we're ready to go on to your next section, please.
All right. And Ryan, I just need control of this presentation again.
Scott, this is Ruth. Brian Bush has a question in the chat. Did you want to address that before you move on, or?
Sure. Brian Johnston, you're up.
Well, this is Brian Bush with Reclamation District 2068.
I'm sorry, Brian.
I kind of have it's kind of a question and a comment. I've been kind of struggling with the question here. I'll just read it. Is it appropriate to use the same model for funding capital improvement projects, which look at these fertility curves using the current conditions of levees for O&M funding? So I understand how performance conditions of the levee relate to capital improvement projects. Essentially, it directly impacts them. And you can look at this one project, how it affects the guys downstream or upstream. However, I don't think these O&M obligations to the bypasses have any connection to how well a levee on the main stem of the river is maintained. So in general, both a good and bad performing levee on the mainstream of the levee of the river needs the bypass. So I'm just kind of, I think this study kind of shows what I want in the end, but I think the method that was used is not quite appropriate.
Do you have an alternative suggestion?
I think what Joe was kind of commenting on is essentially we should be looking at O&M obligations as the start of the project. So you should be looking at before there were levees and then at the design of the levees. Because essentially the bypasses were built there as part of the system so that the levees on the main stem of the river didn't have to go another 20 feet taller. So the fact that you improved your levees, like a lot of the cities have improved their levees to 100 or 200 year standards, which was higher than that, they still need the bypass there. And they were the reason that they don't have to have another 10 feet on top of their levee is because the bypass is there. The O&M obligation should have been set back when the project was initially designed. So I'm kind of more leaning towards what Joe was commenting on.
Well, then you still have this deferred maintenance from the fact that all the LMAs have not maintained their levees in accordance with the standards. So how do you deal with that?
The question I would ask, though, is the fact that we haven't been getting any funding from areas that are receiving benefit the reason why there is deferred maintenance?
Scott, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, this is kind of one of the key stakeholder feedback elements that I was going to cover a little later in the presentation, but I can cover it now. Well, speaking to.
Why don't you just try to answer the question, and then we'll cover it in more detail later on.
Yeah, I mean the question of whether we should be using this model to assess for O&M. It's the approach that we believe is reasonable for determining who's benefiting from operations of the bypass. We've used similar approaches for other local maintaining agencies and their 218 processes to take a project that is in place and determine the benefit of that project in place versus reverting back to a condition when the project was not there. So there's usually a capital improvement assessment that puts a project in place that I think captures what Brian was alluding to is the pre-project condition. I think the comment about the O&M should be in place, that's more of a, kind of a greater policy question that we can address, Brian, when we get to the slides for the yellow bypass. Maybe bring your comment back up in light of the analysis that we've done, and let's push through that question again.
Okay, any other questions at this point? Ryan, do you see anything in the chat?
I see nothing on my end.
Okay, Leslie?
I don't have anything here, Mr. President.
Okay, let's proceed, and then we'll keep in mind Brian's question as we get down the road. I think it's a good question. Thanks, Scott.
Sure. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay, so Joanna has walked through the calculations of damages, and now the focus turns to how do we take those damages, define benefit, and develop an assessment methodology to assess for that benefit. So we start with our existing conditions damages and compare that to a without bypass operations damage. Those values are estimated annual damages. And I will pause here and note that this approach is a little different than local agencies are used to in terms of calculating damages. Typically we would look at a single maximum probable event and calculate damages based on that. In this case, for the purpose of testing feasibility, we wanted to utilize existing studies and tools that we had at our fingertips. So instead of evaluating maximum probable damage throughout the system, we turned to the flood risk modeling to determine an estimated annual damage. So the estimated annual damage is an average over multiple events based on probability. So it's less than the maximum, right? More than the minimum. But for the purpose of testing feasibility, I think it's a good metric for establishing a reasonable methodology and approach. When we get into looking at an implementation plan, we're going to likely reevaluate whether an estimated annual damage is the appropriate path or whether the maximum probable damages is the appropriate approach. But I did want to put that out there. Kind of relates to your previous question, Bill, about whether or not the local agencies understood what we were doing. This is one element that we had to reiterate, that it's not the maximum probable. When you're comparing damages from one area to another, it doesn't always make sense why the damages relative to each other aren't greater. So, and I'll speak to that more as we walk through the study results. So in terms of defining benefit, I highlighted this before in the summary, but we determined or defined the existing benefit equal to the existing conditions damages, the EAD for the existing conditions model. But that existing benefit only applies to areas that are directly protected by a bypass levee. So that's the benefit to properties behind the bypass levee for maintenance of the levee. The incremental benefit is defined by looking at the incremental damages from the without bypass operation, subtracting out the existing conditions damages, and just looking at what's that increment. And that increment is what we're defining the areas that receive benefit from the operations that aren't necessarily directly adjacent to, that's the benefit that they see due to the reduced flows coming down the main stem. We combine those two, we add those two together to determine the combined benefit for each impact area. And then we, before I move on, so then we add up the benefit across all the impact areas and apportion the cost of service based on that. I want to run through what this really means to a few different example LMAs. So the first one I grabbed was Reclamation District 2035. That's within impact area for SAC 16. They maintain about 7.63 miles of the Yolo bypass levee. That's that area or that piece of levee in green right here along the district, along their eastern boundary. There are lands within their district and some lands beyond their district boundaries. You can see their district boundary is a jurisdictional boundary, but the floodplain actually extends beyond it. And so their existing conditions, their EAD from the modeling, sort of a preliminary look at the results here, was about $2.4 million on average per year. When we look at the without bypass conditions, there's no water in the bypass, and therefore there is no incremental damage to lands within the district. So they're without bypass damages are zero.
I have a question about that. Can I ask?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
That's not, I don't think that's logical, what you're saying. There would be failures from the Sacramento River that would flow into where the bypass is now.
Correct. That so I can ask Joanna maybe to talk to that a little bit. But when we ran the model, those spills into the bypass were, I believe, were included in the modeling to a certain extent of how the flow would come over the top of the levee and down through that area. But when put against the levee with the fragility curve, there were no incremental damages above and beyond what they currently are exposed to with bypass operation condition. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, the way you said it before, since you didn't allow water in the bypass, I could see, okay, you get the zero, but if you assume there's no levee there at all, and the Sacramento River levees on the west side is failing, certainly water would flow in there, I would think. But
right. So the geometry, the geometry of the levees was remained intact in the without conditions, without bypass operations. The change that was made was the raising of the Fremont Weir to allow the spill. So the levees are still there in the without bypass operation condition. It's just the spill was not allowed to go in.
okay, well, I guess I have to look at the details of the modeling, but I mean, the way things are now, the Sacramento area levees are higher than all the other levees around there. So certainly the west side of the Sacramento River levees would be failing significantly and putting probably just as much, if not more, water into the Yolo bypass than occurs under the existing system. So, I mean, I'd have to look at the details of that, but thanks.
Yeah, Scott, this is Brian Johnson. Is it
Yes.
maybe not that there's no possibility of damage, but that the damage isn't worse in this scenario?
That's correct. And Joanna, do you want to chime in here with any feedback on how the overflow from the higher or without bypass operations was handled for this instance, this example?
Sure. Yeah, as Scott was saying, the flow was essentially prevented from getting into the yellow bypass, but the levees were left intact. And I think, to your point, Joe, we had gone down the road of possibly removing the bypass levees themselves, but it was a pretty extensive effort as they're divided up into several pieces within the modeling that would have to be taken out and could cause instabilities, etc. So to simplify, we left the levees intact and diverted the flow. So I would say flow, without flow going down the bypass, that this area in particular is not getting inundated, obviously not from the bypass. We'd have to go back and double check the flow coming from the Sacramento River side and see if there were breaches into this area. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe I might just add to clarify or build upon what Joanna said is, we're testing the feasibility of the potential for an SSJDD assessment for this for O&M of the bypass levees. There are certainly nuances to how damages are calculated and benefit is assigned that we need to work through before actually imposing an assessment so that we're properly assigning benefit. But my feeling is that maybe some of the shortcuts we took in the analysis, even if implemented, would still lead us down the same course of testing feasibility. We were just trying to eliminate some of the additional effort that would cause.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions here on this example? So this is an example of a district or an impact area solely protected by a bypass levee, and how the different damages were applied to define benefit. If we look to the next example, being the Thomas Basin, so this is Reclamation District 1000. It does not maintain any levees in the bypass. Lands are protected by the Sac River only. There are existing about $6.8 million of estimated annual damages that occur within the basin with the bypass in operation. And then when we model the bypass out of operation, those damages increase to about $76.5 million. So the higher flows in the main stem spilled out, reached levees, spilled out into the basin, and flooded those lands to a greater depth and increase that damage. So in terms of assigning benefit, their existing benefit is zero because they're not protected. That area is not protected by a bypass levee. Their incremental benefit is the difference between the existing and without bypass conditions, so the 69.7. So their combined benefit, obviously in this case, is just the sum of those two, but it's the 69.7 million. The third example we wanted to bring up are those districts that are sandwiched between the bypass and the Sacramento River. So in these instances, they have benefit from, or they have flooding potential from both sources. The example here is Reclamation District 900 in West Sacramento. It actually spans two impact areas. but they maintain about 6.42 miles of YOLO bypass levee, shown there on the left side on that green line. Their lands are protected by both the YOLO bypass levee and the Sac River levees. In the existing conditions model, they have about $8.6 million worth of damage, estimated annual damage. And then when we took the bypass out of operation in that model, the damages to these two impact areas increased to 38.2 million. And so for districts that are located between the two systems, we add the existing benefit plus the incremental to get to a combined benefit. So those are three examples of how the damages are applied for defining benefit. I think I have a break here for questions, if there are any other questions related to those examples and how we're assigning damages to define benefit.
I have another question, if it's okay.
Sure.
If you go back a slide to the Sacramento, this one. When you did this modeling and there's these failures occurring because there's no Sutter bypass and no YOLO bypass. So it seems to me the water would fail those upstream levees and flow historically to these bypass areas. I mean, I'm doubtful that it would actually probably be a benefit to the Safeka area if these upstream levees were failing. So how did you handle that? Did you, when the water was failed upstream, did it not come down to the Safeka area? Or you see what I'm saying? How did the water get to the Safeka area if the upstream levees are failing? That's, I guess, my question.
So I have, I suspect I might know, but I am going to turn that back to the experts. So Joanna, if you could talk about how the modeling utilizes the river stage to define the flood damages.
Yes.
That's the crux of the issue.
I think I will actually pass it one more time to my colleague Rick McCallan, who is on the line today. He really focused on the hydraulic modeling and the different geometries and where triggers were happening and how the flow navigated its way throughout the system. Rick, would you mind taking that question? I think he's on.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Trying to unmute. Took a second. Yeah, so basically what we had done is, like you're saying, there is some flow that is breaking out upstream, but overall there's still an increase in stage as we go down in the Sacramento system. So yes, the breaching and water going into the historical flow path, which became the bypasses, is happening to some degree, but it is not to the same amount as if we still had the Fremont Weir operating and Moulton and Calusa, etc. Just because the breaches we configured are not to that size in degree, so the water is still going down the channel itself. There is overtopping of the levees, obviously, along the way, but basically the system stays to a higher, fuller level throughout, and then once we start getting into the benefit analysis, that's where we start seeing the differences in stage at the same for the same event that's kind of where we get, more damage happening in the Safeka area compared to the existing system. So,
well, let me ask this: are you assuming a certain breach width or something? I mean, the whole dang levee might go down.
yeah, this is like I said, these are assumptions that were made for the CVFPB analysis. I think the breach width was 25 times the levee height for that analysis. So again, this is using off-the-shelf models and things like that. So for an actual, analysis of this system, we definitely have to go in and revisit a lot of these assumptions for, to make sure it's realistic for the scenario that we're painting.
Yeah, because there might be multiple failures, not just one, so anyways.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I agree with you there.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I guess we can proceed, Scott. Any other questions, by the way?
Okay, I'll move on unless there's anything in the chat or that I'm not seeing. All right, hearing none, I will move forward. So one of the first things that came out of the beneficiary analysis results out of the modeling was that the modeling did not indicate that the beneficiaries between the Sutter and YOLO bypass operations were codependent on each other. So benefit within the Sutter bypass or upstream of the Fremont Weir, I'll say, was independent of what was happening south of the Fremont Weir. And what that allowed us to do then, since they're separate and since they're independent, is we were able to analyze for two separate assessments. One looking at just the Sutter bypass O&M, and one looking at the YOLO bypass O&M. So at this point in time, I'm going to start walking through a series of figures and tables to get into the meat of the analysis and the results. We have about, I think, 6 tables for each bypass and a few figures to look at. So Ryan, if you could switch over to the PDF for the Sutter bypass and bring that up. Board members, I believe this was distributed along with the PowerPoint. If you have that at your fingertips on your desktop, it might be more legible to read versus trying to read through the PowerPoint or through the WebEx. And if you don't, just let me know if you need me to zoom in or pause on something. Okay, so for the Sutter bypass assessment for the beneficiary analysis, the assessment methodology, the first thing we needed to do was to identify which portions of the system we would be including in the assessment. So as I stated before, with regards to the authority and SSG.
Give Jeff you the summary. Thanks.
Sorry, I got a little feedback there. The SSJDD authority does not allow for operation and maintenance funds to be spent on 8361 facilities. So the first thing we did was identify what those facilities were, where they are in the system. And in this figure 1A, the portions of levee that are green are sections of levee or reaches of levee that are maintained by local agencies or reclamation districts. The facilities in orange are 8361 facilities. So the first thing we did was looking at the fact the east side of the Sutter bypass is all 8361. We excluded evaluating any impacts east of the bypass. That was a question that came up from stakeholders that I'll get to at the end of this results. But for the analysis that we're looking at, we only looked at those portions of the bypass maintained by local agencies. And trying to advance here. Here we go. One too far. All right, apologies, this is a little touchy here. All right, our first step was to identify the cost of the service being provided. Again, apologies here. So we looked at which LMAs are maintaining the facilities within the system. So the first column, again, is the impact areas. Those are the areas of analysis from the FDA model. We identified which LMAs reside within each impact area. And then for each of those LMAs, we identified how many miles of levee they're maintaining on the bypass. We utilize recommended funding levels from the 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update of $46,000 per levee mile for rural communities or rural areas. And I think I want to point out here that, you know, this 46,000 a mile is sort of a programmatic forward planning number. Doesn't reflect actual costs. It assumes that there are no deferred or uncured deficiencies in the levee. And for the purpose of testing feasibility, we felt that these numbers were adequate for running through the analysis. So in the fifth column there, you'll see the O&M budget for each district is the number of bypass miles multiplied by the cost per mile to come up with a total budget. So for the Sutter bypass, we're looking at about little under $2.1 million for the local maintaining agencies to maintain their levees. That's the number that we're utilizing for the assessment that we're testing. The last column is the percent of total cost that each reclamation district is assigned. So this is strictly their portion of the budget. So now we walk into the meat of the beneficiary analysis. So this is a summary table of results that came out of the hydraulic modeling. Again, we have start in the first column. These are the impact areas that the hydraulic analysis and the FDA model is based on. We identified what LMAs are within those impact areas. And I think it's important here to note the numbers we get out of the analysis are by impact area. And what we've done for the purpose of this summary is to allocate those figures, or those amounts, to each LMA strictly based on their acreage. So there may be some nuances that are slightly different because it really depends on where the structures or crops are located. But we just simplified the summary here based on based on acreage. So column A, the third column in, this is the estimated annual damages from the existing conditions model, and these are in thousands of dollars. Column B is the estimated annual damages from the without bypass operations model, again in thousands of dollars. We calculated the existing benefit for each area that's equal to the existing conditions damages so long as you are protected directly by a bypass levee. So you'll see that only those districts towards the bottom of the table, those are the districts that are maintaining the levees. Those are the districts that have an existing conditions or an existing benefit. The incremental benefit is the next column over, column D, which is the difference between the without bypass operation and existing conditions model. And then the combined benefit in column E, we take the next step and we add the existing and incremental benefit together. And then the last column, we're calculating the percent of total benefit, which would be the total benefit of O&M of the bypass system with local maintaining agencies maintaining the system, what their percent of the benefit is. So just to pick an example, if we were to look at, say, RD 1001, part of the way down, SAC 30, they're existing and without system damages are there. They are sandwiched between, or actually they're receiving benefit by channelizing the Feather River through that section. And they have about 11% of the benefit received out of the total benefit of Sutter bypass operations. I'm sure we're going to have questions. Let me run through the analysis and then we can come back to anything specific. I put together a few figures here just to show kind of geographically how the analysis unfolded, or the results unfolded. Areas in pink here are the impact areas that have existing benefit. So again, these are areas that are directly behind the bypass system levees. Go to the next slide. The next figure here, these are areas that receive the incremental benefit from having additional flow in this main stem. You can see we pick up damage here on the east side or on the west side of the Sac River main stem, as well as incremental damage to those areas between the main stem and the bypass, because now their main stem flooding has increased, or water levels have increased and increased flooding, as well as increased down here for RD 1001, SAC 30, because we're artificially channelizing that water through the main stem. The next figure here is the combined benefit, just to show dollar-wise where the dollars of damages, where the dollars of benefit are residing, but very similar to the incremental benefit. Okay, so now the next step, now that we have the benefit identified and quantified, we then allocate the budget for the service based on the benefit. So to walk through this table, again, impact areas with LMAs on the left-hand side. The third column there is the amount of combined benefit to the impact area. And the column adjacent to it, to the right, is how that amount of benefit was allocated to each LMA. We did this because we felt that stakeholders would want to understand what's going on in their particular district, but we didn't calculate on a district by district basis. That's not how the model is set up. So once we have the combined benefit within each LMA, we multiplied the budget to, we calculated that total combined benefit again. That was from the previous table, that percent of total benefit. So then in the last column, we took the budget to maintain the levies and multiplied that by the percent of the combined benefit to identify the cost to each area, the cost of O&M to each area based on the benefit that they receive. As I stated earlier, we wanted to include in the methodology the ability to credit those LMAs that were already assessing properties within their district to perform the work. So in this table demonstrates how we applied that credit. Again, left-hand side, impact areas with LMAs. The third column is the allocation of the O&M budget that came from the last table. And then the fourth column over is the credit for O&M work. And this is based on the budget and cost to that district to maintain that portion of the levy that came from table 1. We subtracted that credit off of the allocation of the budget to come up with what the potential assessment would be for each area. So if I were to walk through an example here again, SAC 30, RD 1001, their allocation of the budget based on the benefit is $235,674 right here. Because they're performing that work, their credit is $332,961. And so they essentially would not have an assessment because their credit is equal to or greater than the benefit that they receive from when we spread the benefit out, so their budget allocation. What this results in, you'll see a great amount of assessment to areas that do not directly maintain a bypass levy. We have one area, this is RD 1500, where their benefit from O&M is slightly greater than the amount of work that they're performing based on the assumptions that we've made. So there's still a slight increased assessment in that area. There's a couple of these nuances, 1500 and RD 900 as well. I think we need to work through what that looks like. Doesn't make sense to assess and return revenue to the same district. So we need to work through that in the implementation plan about how that would be carried out. But if you look at the total amount of the assessment being $630,000, compare that to the total budget to maintain the levies of $2 million. What this implies is that somewhere between a third to a quarter of the benefit resides outside of local LMAs maintaining that system. That was the takeaway there at the end. So we took those aggregate assessment amounts and made some very gross assumptions about how that would be spread across the structure inventory because we do not have individual damage calculations by each structure. It's an aggregate amount from the modeling. So you can see these are average assessment rates that would be applied to generate that revenue. SAC 08 is predominantly the Colusa area. SAC 09, I believe, is the Grimes area community. And SAC 13, I believe, is Knights Landing. So you can see these are substantial rates. You know, they are, I don't want to say they are what they are, but that's what the analysis is indicating to us, that we would have high rates in rural communities. Obviously, that does not check off the box of affordability, and probably would not check off the box of stakeholder buy-in in terms of determining if an assessment for Sutter bypass operation and maintenance would be feasible. Also, to this goal of assisting rural communities with maintenance, we're basically shifting the burden from one rural community to another. That's not really meeting the objective either. We wanted to run through the analysis, though, just to be able to say that in this instance, this is not a feasible opportunity to apply this methodology or apply an assessment. That sort of a prelude of what we anticipate our feasibility testing to be for a Sutter bypass levy O&M, but you know, to sort of state in advance of probably some questions that would be coming, I wanted to make that statement. I think the last slide here is meant to demonstrate how the revenue that would be generated from this assessment would be allocated back to the LMAs for to supplement their O&M funding. So the Central Valley Flood Protection Board under SSJDD would collect these revenues, and then they have to determine what are they going to do with these revenues. So this is the proposed method that we came up with. And that is to allocate that revenue back to the LMAs maintaining the bypass based on their percent of the total budget used to calculate the assessment. So from table 1, we brought forward the O&M budget for each LMA or each impact area. We brought forward the percent of the total. And so we used those percentages to allocate the revenue from the SSJDD assessment and redistribute that revenue back to the LMAs maintaining. So again, to run through an example here, I've been using SAC 30 as the example. They generate about, their budget is about $336,720. It's a little over 16% of the total budget to maintain the levees. And so they would receive a little over 16% of the $630,000 generated by the SSJDD assessment, and would receive then about $102,600. That's how the money would flow from the property owners to the Central Valley Flood Board back to the LMAs to supplement O&M. So I think that is our last table here. I think before I move back, I have a slide on, I think the next slide's on stakeholder feedback. But before we move back to the slide deck, any questions on the table set, number crunching? Everybody got it. It's a lot to take in. It's dense. So any questions on anything so far?
I see no questions in the chat.
Okay. Any questions from board members? Comments? Okay, Ryan, if you could flip back to the slide deck and move to slide 41. I'll tell you what stakeholders felt when they saw these results. Okay, so the first thing they brought up was a question about how we were modeling the without bypass condition. And in that model, Joanna alluded to, we artificially turned all the valves off that allowed flow into the bypass. And one of those mechanisms was to raise levees at the lower end of Butte Sink and basically shunt that water over to the main stem of the Sac River. And so their question was that may not be the most appropriate approach, because the flows that came down Butte Sink before the bypass was built should naturally be allowed to pass through that area and not be pushed over to the Sac River, because that wasn't the purpose of building the bypass. The bypass levees were there to channelize that flow that came down from the Butte Sink, plus accommodate additional diversions off the Sac River. So we are developing, we're going back and looking at the modeling to see if there's any changes that we think we should make, which we think are appropriate. But in light of the feasibility testing, it wouldn't make sense to redo a bunch of hydraulic analysis if we believe the feasibility has already been determined based on anticipated average assessment rates and stakeholder buy-in. So we're going to evaluate how we might modify that and then bring that in alongside the feasibility test. Let's see here. Get to the next slide. The other question they had was related to why we excluded properties on the east side of the bypass. So again, the purpose for that assumption up front was that those properties are protected by the east side of the bypass, which is an 8361 facility. So the state should continue to maintain or fund the maintenance of the bypass, and we excluded that from our analysis. There were questions about whether they still receive a benefit anyway, regardless of who's maintaining the bypass levee. And when we looked at that, the Wadsworth Canal, I don't know if my cursor is showing up for you, but it's this kind of piece of levee that's sticking out here, just south of the Buttes. The Wadsworth Canal collects water that drains out of areas from the north and east. Oh, I'm getting control from Ryan here. So maybe you can see, you'll see it here in a second. So these, this area drains down through the Wadsworth Canal. And so when that's turned off, that flow would continue down into this other area here. And we felt that since the Wadsworth Canal is also an 8360, or at least this portion is also an 8361 facility, that the beneficiary still reside on this east side, that there's no benefit to that water getting into the bypass aside from the fact that it's an 8361 facility. So we haven't squared that up with stakeholders yet. We're going to be meeting with them to kind of walk through that logic. But again, working with the premise that we're testing feasibility, we'll drive this to as close a resolution as we can, but we may not need to drive through all the nuances if we can reach a feasibility determination.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm really struggling with this analysis, and I wonder what's the premise for saying we had a system that was designed to have a main river and a bypass. That's how the system was designed. And now we're saying, well, we're going to shut off part of the system. What's the basis for that? Why didn't you remove all the levees and just let the water flow through there? What's the premise for just shutting down the bypass?
So I think I can answer your question. Let me try, and you tell me if I get there. So the purpose of the assessment is for O&M of a facility that's already constructed in place. And although the O&M responsibilities, didn't get spread to all benefiting properties, right? It resides on specific LMAs and partially on the state. In order to identify which properties benefit from the operations of the bypass, that's why we turned it off. So that was our best approach to determining where those beneficiaries are off of the main stem and how to quantify the benefit that they receive from flow down the bypass. So that's the why to the approach. Now, does that?
Well,
so we weren't going back to a pre-project.
The benefit actually be that you couldn't have had the levees on the river if you didn't have the bypass. They wouldn't work. They never would be built. So the benefit is that the levees are able to protect the main stem. I wouldn't have been there. So that would be the benefit, it seems to me, of removing the levees on the main stem, because you wouldn't have the bypass available. I don't know. I mean, it's very structured, and I mean, I haven't had the chance to go and look at this, but I think there's probably thousands of assumptions, or maybe that's overstatement, at least hundreds of assumptions of where water's going and how when levees fail. And just as the example there of the Butte Basin flows, that it seems like it's heavily dependent upon what the assumptions are. I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Well, I think that is part of this feasibility analysis is this approach the appropriate approach? Is it feasible to assess in this manner? We thought of other ways to isolate the benefit of maintaining the bypass levees, and we couldn't come up with another approach that could isolate impacts of bypass operation from flows down the main stem. This was the only way that we could come up with.
But it can't be separated, though. They're interdependent. I mean, that's how it was designed. As a system, you can't just, the system, you couldn't have the Sacramento side, say, or the rivers, let's not say Sacramento, but the river side benefit if you didn't have the bypass. It wouldn't work. So it seems that the benefit of maintaining it is you're allowing also the protection of the main stem. And we're missing that. Because if you, like I was saying, if you come down to Sacramento, it's not showing the true benefit of the bypass, I don't believe. Because you wouldn't have the levees around Sacramento if you didn't have the bypass. So I think somehow we're not getting the benefit analysis quite right there. But I appreciate this is an overview, and I'm talking very specific questions about the modeling that I don't understand, and maybe I just need to at some point sit down and get a better understanding of it. But thank you.
So basically my takeaway is the approach flawed from the get-go? Is this the appropriate approach? And we'll take that into consideration and noodle on that and come back with a more thought through response for you.
Scott, I think Joe's right. I think you have to take the system as it was originally designed and take different portions out of it completely and determine what the benefit of having that additional part put back in. And what I think I heard Joanna say was that's not what the existing models show, and it would take an extensive amount of work to do that. But I think in order, even on a conceptual basis and on a feasibility basis, you would have to do that in order to even test the feasibility of this. So, it seems to me that's a cost item, which we're going to have to, okay, what's that going to cost to adjust that model? But in order to get it right, I think that has to happen, or it's not going to make sense.
Okay.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, the reason we didn't do that in the first place was because the model didn't do it that way.
Yeah, I think there's two issues here that I'm hearing. One is, do we make the appropriate changes in the model to reflect how the flow would spill out and run through the system? I think that's one question I'm hearing. The other question is, we modeled the bypass without operation, without making any other changes. Is that a reasonable approach, or is there some other analysis or modeling that needs to occur to analyze the system from a different angle, from a different vantage point?
Yeah, but I think the number one is the crucial point. That's the point we've got to answer, because if you don't model the existing system the way it was designed and take out portions to find out what the impact of that is, you're not really modeling reality. So that's I think the underlying problem Joe's having. I believe he can talk for himself, but that's what I hear. Then from that, okay, we've got an existing system. We're taking out portions of it. Are there ways to operate it differently that would also minimize the assessment or whatever you need to do? But the first part is the crucial part, because if you don't do that, then you're going to always get this question. And it was raised by not Brian Johnson, but the other Brian
Bush. Yes.
Yeah, he was saying essentially the same thing. You're not modeling reality. Now, he was talking about as it was existed. I don't think you need to do that, because all kinds of things have changed, but I think you need to at least model the existing system as it says, not take an assumption based upon something that it's not reality. That's the kind of the way I'm looking at it. Maybe we need to think about that a little bit.
All right, I will take that away as a takeaway to come back with a clarification on how we started with the existing system modeling and how we moved into the testing of taking pieces out of the system and testing their approach. You know, we took it as a whole system. Maybe that's not the appropriate approach. Well, I don't think I answered that question to you today, but I will take that away and be sure to come back.
Just one more comment from me, Jane Dolan here. It seems to me, well, we got pretty far along for what seems to be a lot of questions of how come it was done this way. And I think the feedback that you received from local area stakeholders needs to be taken pretty seriously. If this is going to be fulfilled, then those who have been in the local maintaining area work for decades are going to need to understand it. And at this point, I'm not sure I can answer their questions, and they're going to ask board members, what do you think about this? So I think the way our president summarized it is it should be, take that pretty seriously, because that made sense to me. And then, of course, board member Countryman, who's got a lot of experience up here. But taking away the function of the Butte Basin overflows makes no sense to me, because there is no structural, that's a natural overflow that's always occurred. You know, I lived with that and I read it, and battling the inland sea. So that's there. That's not going to change. There are no levees there. So that's something else that certainly anybody north of Cluse is going to say, what?
Right.
So it's got to have some kind of way to explain it to the person who's going to be taxed, or it's DOA.
Right. I agree. Okay, I'm gonna continue through here. So this was what we discussed about areas east of the bypass, feedback we have received. And then lastly, of course, was feedback that the assessment rates are very high for rural communities. We tended to agree with that, and that will certainly fall out in our feasibility testing when we get to that. So I've had some questions so far. Are there any other questions before we move to the YOLO bypass analysis, which we'll probably have similar questions, but we'll walk through it. We have it for you. Any other questions at this point? Yes.
I do. You suggested a couple of ways that the modeling, could be tweaked for, based on stakeholder feedback. But you were also pointing out, again at the end, what the, rates would be in table 5A. And I'm wondering if you have a gut instinct as to how much change, making those tweaks to the model would change the, sort of overall conclusion about the rates in that table. Like how sensitive do you think it is?
So you're referring to table, the average assessment rates, right? They were looking like somewhere on the order of 150 to 2 something a single family home. I think the flows coming down out of the Butte Sink were, Joanna can jump in here, but they were significant. I think the comment was you would still have a bypass if you allow those to come through. There's quite a bit. So those numbers could maybe cut in half, maybe less. We'll certainly look at that and try to quantify that a rough estimate of what we think would happen before we embark on those changes, if we think we've already made a determination on feasibility.
Right. Yeah, because I gathered you sort of asking, whether it's worth it to, to keep running the model and tweaking it. And so I was kind of following up on that, and, getting a sense of how much it, might possibly matter.
I think for Calusa, for the Calusa area, it'd be, pretty significant because those flows are all coming over to Calusa first. Theirs might significantly decrease. I'm not sure about the areas for Grimes and Knights Landing.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions on Sutter bypass analysis?
Scott, isn't the takeaway here, and I think it would be the same in the YOLO bypass, the fact that the assessments for the rural areas are simply unaffordable. And, we're going to be looking to the urban areas to determine what amount they feel is reasonable to transfer from their assessment to the rural assessments to pay their cost of maintaining the levee. And whether it's $50 a year or $100 a year, the policy question, is it worth $100 a year to sustain agriculture or sustain, open space in those areas to the urban areas? And that's the benefit that would derive from the urban areas to keep those rural areas safe so we could sustain agriculture and open space. Isn't that really the policy question here?
I think that's one of the policy questions. If you were to, say you were not able to sustain it and the levees were to go, unmaintained, that would be, more or less the take of land. And so you're sort of offsetting the cost of maybe widening, considering widening bypass areas or something. I don't know if the policy question is strictly around maintaining agriculture and open space so much as recognizing the benefit to the urban areas for work being done in the rural areas. I think that's more the crux of the policy. Is that appropriate to shift that?
Yeah, but the bottom line is that if it is, and if we don't want to urbanize the rural areas, generally, we don't want to urbanize the area, then you got to pay for that. And the ones that can afford it are the urban areas, because for a whole variety of reasons. And that should be in the public interest. It seems to me that's where this is probably going.
Bill?
Yeah.
I think we've been infected a little bit with the Corps of Engineers thinking here of incremental analysis. I think, and we've argued, the state has argued, and the board has argued that it's a system and should be evaluated as what the system benefit is. And I think this analysis that we're getting today is kind of feeding into this incremental approach versus the system-wide approach. So the thing that's like bothering me a little bit is, I don't want to say this will be the third time, so I swear I will not say this again, but the system was designed with a bypass and a main river. And you couldn't have had the main river if you didn't have the bypass. So the benefits of the system are really combined for everybody's getting the benefit some more than others. And if we think of Sacramento, for example, it's getting a huge benefit from the bypass. But there's like no responsibility to help with the maintenance. We're say we who we live in Sacramento get the main benefit from the bypass, but we don't share in the maintenance of the bypass.
Right.
And that's the part that's bothering me. And that's why I think that the analysis would be the removal of all of it. If you remove the bypass, you got to remove the river too. You couldn't have one without the other. And if you just move the one, especially if you look at the conditions now with the wonderful job that SAFE has done around Sacramento, I honestly believe that you start just failing those upstream levees, Sacramento's never going to flood. Those failures of those levees will actually help them. So I don't think we're getting to the heart of it the way we're doing, saying we're not going to put water in a bypass and over here and then there'll be failures. I don't think we're getting at the true benefit ratio of benefit to help with the maintenance that Sacramento could contribute. That's what I'm trying to say, and I'm probably not saying it very well. But so anyway, I've said it 3 times, so I won't bring it up again.
Fair enough. I've written it down 3 times, so just so you know. Do have it. Good catch that. All right. So although we have some I'll say questions about the methodology, we do have results for the YOLO bypass, and maybe I'll put it, Bill, up to you. Do you feel it's worth the board's time to run through these results, given the questions on the methodology, to see how this methodology played out for the YOLO bypass, or should we step back and come back with addressing these questions?
Well, I think we're going to have to address the methodology, the underlying assumption of the methodology, because it's in the end, it's going to have to make sense to people. And if you're somehow using a methodology that doesn't accept the system as it exists now, and you're taking pieces of it away, you're not either addressing Joe's question or my question on terms of the benefit to the urban areas. So that's an important question, but I think it'd be helpful if we could, using the methodology that we've criticized, or not criticized, but commented on, commented on based on just our feeling. I think it would be helpful to go through and find out what the numbers come out to be on the YOLO bypass. If we could do that, since we've been through the analysis on the methodology, how did it fare in the YOLO bypass? Sure. Now, by the way, on the YOLO bypass, did you make a base assumption that all of these things that are being done by the partnership are part of the baseline, or what? Are they included?
You definitely beat one of the stakeholders to the punch. That was part of the feedback. But no, we did not. We used the existing condition model that we had readily available and used that for our baseline condition. Now, that's one of the feedback that we got from stakeholders that I'll talk about.
Yeah, well, I agree. Whoever brought that up, I agree. That's just part of our analysis of what we said. We gotta analyze what's there now, the existing system, or people are going to raise these issues, and there's no reason I guess it'd be cost of doing the analysis, but that's what it is. We ought to be including those. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll run through the analysis. Ryan, if you could bring up the YOLO bypass slides while he's doing that. We'll run through the analysis we'll get to the stakeholder feedback, which is very similar to, I think, what we're hearing today. And then we'll determine a path forward after that. Okay, so while Ryan's passing control over, you see here, thank you, Ryan. So this is going to be the same presentation as you saw before in terms of the steps and figures and tables. We'll just run through those as they are. Again, this is the system we analyzed, or the approach we used. The levies in green are the levies maintained by local maintenance agencies. The facilities in orange are 8361 facilities, and those were not included when determining the budget. So in this instance, you know, we have, again, impact areas with LMAs within the impact areas. We've identified the length of bypass levees that are maintained by LMAs and determined the budget based on the recommendations from the 2017 update. In this case, we have some urban areas maintaining bypass levees. So we've used the 58,000 a mile versus the 46,000 a mile in the rural areas. Again, those are kind of long-term planning levels for the purpose of testing feasibility. They don't reflect actual costs, and they don't reflect, or they assume that all maintenance deficiencies have been cured. So multiplying those two across, we come up with a total budget of about $4.4 million to maintain the YOLO bypass for local agencies maintaining the bypass levy.
So that's about twice as much as the Sutter bypass?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And it's not just because the difference in size or length. You know, a majority of the Sutter bypass, not a majority, but a great deal of the Sutter bypass is an 8361 facility.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right.
This is Jane Dolan. If there's
Yes.
no LMA on your table, what did you use to assign the dollar figure? The acreage and the dollar figure.
Right. So like here in SAC 42, we said no LMA here. Part of that is that there either wasn't an LMA readily available for us to grab and determine who is maintaining that, or we were questioning who is maintaining that. It's still a state plan of flood control system that's not listed in the 8361, so we assumed that an LMA local agency was maintaining, and so we just applied the rule or the method rate to that. Does that answer your question? Great. All right. So this second table here, I'm not sure how to zoom in. Let me see if I can zoom in here. That make it a little easier for folks to read. So this is the summary table of the beneficiary analysis using the methodology that we've talked through and have concerns on, but the results that came out of that analysis. Again, the existing conditions in column A is the system as is in place today. The without bypass damages in column B is when we turned all the valves off for natural diversion into the bypass. through the weirs. In this case, predominantly from Fremont and from the Sacramento weirs. We assign the existing benefit equal to the existing conditions damages to areas protected, directly protected by a bypass levee. And then the incremental benefit, again, is the amount of damages that would occur if the system were not, if the bypass were not in operation. And those are listed there in column D. We add those together and we determine the percent of the total combined benefit for each area in the analysis. Whoop. So let me zoom out here a little. So again, we have three figures here just to demonstrate where the benefit is lying. These are the areas in pink that have existing benefit as a result of maintaining the bypass levees. Get it to advance here. Not going too far. So this is where all the incremental benefit lies. So this is, you know, an attempt to reflect who is benefiting by how much from having the bypass in operation and not allowing that water to flow down the main stem. And then just combining those two, these are the areas of benefit of all properties in the combined system, combined benefit. So now we flip back to the numbers crunching again. And this is the summary of allocating the budget to maintain the yellow bypass levees based on the benefit received. And so it's strictly taking the percent of the total benefit of the prior table, multiplying that by the $4.4 million to maintain the bypass levees for each area. So each area receives a certain percentage of that based on the benefit. Table 4B demonstrates how we're what areas we're crediting for work being done. There are a few nuances here. You know, RD 900, for instance, is one agency, so we kind of split their budget between the two. Partially arbitrary, but if you take them in aggregate amount, you can view that. But RD 900 is one of those districts that the benefit they're receiving from the increase in benefit they're receiving due to the higher flows that would otherwise come down the main stem of the Sacramento River exceeds the credit that they for O&M that they receive. So they would be included in the assessment. But for the rest of the districts that maintain the bypass levees, their credit exceeds their benefit. And so we're left with just areas receiving benefit beyond the LMAs. And in this case, you know, $3.6 million is collected from areas outside of the local LMAs compared to the 4.4. So in this case, about 3/4 of the benefit you could generalize is realized outside of the local LMAs that maintain the bypass, which I think is consistent with what we've been hearing here today. But the path to get there, I think, is what we need to strive to maybe improve the messaging there. These are average assessment rates. There are a few areas where we have high rates, you can see. I think that really speaks to the frequency of flooding that comes out of the fragility curves. And that I think can be resolved in a plan to maybe move away from estimated annual damages to maximum probable damage. We can also address that with changing what our baseline assumptions are, and I'll get to that comment from stakeholders at the end. If we were to take an example here and look at, say, Natomas Basin, probably a fairly already highly assessed for levee improvements, we would be looking at about $28 per home, single family home, $10 per 1,000 square foot for multifamily residential complexes, about $13.50 per 1,000 square foot for commercial industrial. And it's not that the ag rates are zero, it's just that they're very low in comparison to the structure damage. So my takeaway here is that these rates seem a little more palatable, although not inconsequential, but at least more palatable. And if you were to look, if you take SAC 14, you take SAC 41 and SAC 46 out, I think those are the areas that are impacted by what our assumptions are for a baseline condition. And those rates should significantly decrease. Within the area of Sacramento, city of Sacramento, we're looking at maybe more on the order of $9 a single family home on average. $5 per 1,000 square foot for commercial industrial. These just seemed more attainable because there's a broader base to spread that benefit across. And so lastly, this last table shows how the assessment revenue would be reallocated to the districts that are maintaining the facilities. And again, it's based on their percentage of the total budget. So I apologize for not including the LMAs in this table. I should include those next time. But this revenue has been passed back to those districts that are maintaining the levy. So again, about 3.6 million would be collected through that assessment passback. So I'll pause here for any questions on just gut feeling on the analysis. We've had quite a bit on the methodology and whether that's appropriate, but any, I guess, comments on the results here for yellow bypass? Okay. Not hearing any. Ryan, if you could move back to the slide deck and advance to looks like slide 48. All right. Control now. All right, so what do we hear back from stakeholders on this from the yellow bypass analysis? The question of what's the appropriate existing condition came up. This kind of speaks to using a pre-project condition. What should we be using to determine our existing conditions damage? we've kind of talked about this today. Our feeling to date was that a pre-project condition would be appropriate for a capital improvement project, but not for an O&M assessment. But we have heard now that you can't have one with the other. So there's some sort of hybrid approach we need to identify. So we'll continue to work on that and work through that with stakeholders. I think you heard from Brian Bush today, this is his primary question was how, what are we using pre-project? So we'll work through that with stakeholders and get back. The other question we had, and Bill, you kind of brought this up, what's the appropriate levy condition to use? Are we considering, some of the work being done by the partnership out there? There was general kind of consensus from the stakeholders that we should look at, instead of the current existing conditions, look at the fully implemented CVFPB model as the basis. That approach would take into account all improvements that were planned, and so you wouldn't have this situation where you have areas that are flooding more frequently because their levees haven't been improved, and then would have to redo the analysis as levees become improved through the system. So based on that recognition, we think to simplify the administration in the future, we'd also recommend determining what an appropriate future condition is for the baseline condition, whether that's a fully implemented CVFPB or some other minimum level of standard to apply. So we're thinking about what that would be. We'll continue to develop those recommendations and look at what those modifications to the fragility curves would look like. We'll probably do some sensitivity testing to see what the impacts of that are to the assessment rates, and then work through that with stakeholders and board staff to finalize and perform our feasibility testing on. That would all take place along with resolving the questions that we have today on the fundamental approach and analysis.
One of the things about the fragility curves, maybe they're improved, but my experience with them isn't necessarily, I haven't found them to be very realistic. If you compare the historic performance of a levee with what the fragility curve says, they don't jive necessarily. And so I think we just need to take a kind of a careful look at that. Is the fragility curve assumptions consistent, or how do we make it realistic is I guess what I'm trying to say. And maybe these are fine because I haven't looked at these, but I'm just saying in the past when I've reviewed the fragility curves, they have not been consistent with historic performance.
Right, and I think that goes to, we're trying to use readily available tools for us to test out a methodology. And part of that is identifying, what new tools or what different analyses need to take place to be more realistic. So we'll include that evaluation of fragility curves against past performance, determine that.
I'd also add, Scott, this is Joanna, that when we started out on this, we were attempting to remain consistent with a lot of the assumptions included in the 2022 CVFPB update. So, perhaps that thinking might need to shift based on today's conversation. But that's how we went into it, was let's start with the same modeling tools used for CVFPB. Let's stay with the same assumptions as far as what the existing state of the system is, what the fragility curves look like, the most updated information being used for the new plan. But yeah, certainly open to more discussion on that.
Right. That's right. Okay, so the last bit of feedback that we received when we did this analysis initially and presented the stakeholders, there were two impact areas that we had excluded, 43 and 46. This is in the south area, south below Sacramento, kind of Elk Grove, the western side of Elk Grove. Stakeholders in that meeting felt that those areas probably benefited as well, and that we should include them. So in the results that you saw today, we added those impact areas back in, but we did receive some just-in-time feedback from another stakeholder there that there are private levees that protect structures and infrastructure in Elk Grove that are certified by FEMA. We need to go back and look and see how our model treated those levees. It may not and probably did not account for the fact those levees were there. So we need to make sure that the benefit that's in that south area, in the western Elk Grove area, is appropriate. So we'll do that, and we'll make any corrections that are there that need to be made.
Those are the levees around Laguna.
Yes.
The Laguna development. Now, have they actually been certified by FEMA?
Is Rick Reinhardt still on the? I think Rick would know the answer to that.
They must have gotten a CLOMAR or LOMAR or whatever it is for those. Is that the way that worked?
My understanding, I heard back from Rick, was that FEMA did certify those through
Okay.
LOMAR process.
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Okay, so before next steps, let me pause here. Any other questions on what we've seen today so far? Any other comments?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
So this is Brian Bush again from RD 2068. To me, we're nitpicking over the details of how these numbers come out, but even with this analysis, look at some of these districts, particularly mine, for example. I'm in area 59 and 60, which is at the bottom there of the yellow bypass. Essentially, if following this analysis, 90% of my budget would be funded by the SSJDD. So for what I'm saying is right now, I have the full burden of maintaining these levees, but there's an additional, I can only assess 10% of the beneficiaries. That's something to think about.
Right. Right, and that was the whole premise for pursuing this category, right? Was to address that, Brian. And I think that was brought up by your group from the get-go. So I think we're heading, from what I'm hearing from you, we're heading in the right direction. It's just the means in which we get there need to be vetted out more clearly and appropriately.
Okay, any other questions?
All right. I wanted to just walk through some next steps here before leaving you today. So this is what I had planned for next steps for category 1. I've heard a lot of other things I need to include in here. So we'll be evaluating everything that we've heard from stakeholders, plus what we've heard today. And we'll be reviewing our approach and making adjustments, and likely be coming back with updated results. But at some point in time, we need to drive to a methodology and results that are refined enough to make a feasibility testing and make statements about how much we think we could generate out of this assessment in comparison to the recommendations in the strategy plan, investment strategy plan. For the other two categories, we've heard, so for regional and programmatic improvements, we plan on looking to the Feather River Basin as a sort of a test case. We did receive some feedback from stakeholders in this region that this might be an avenue that could be utilized. We want to get some more specifics on maybe some exact services or activities that they'd be interested in versus just looking at a broader, what if you needed $1 million to do some sort of activity? That would be the other approach. But try to get some specifics, narrow down the modeling that we would do to reflect that benefit, and then develop preliminary results with stakeholders. Similarly for category 3, we have a test case. The town of Princeton has a small community flood risk reduction project that was identified in their feasibility study. There's been some level of financial analysis already done as part of that study that our firm did to identify potential assessment rates. So we're going to leverage that information and basically flesh out what the methodology would be and results, and review that with stakeholders. That's category 3. In terms of schedule, was kind of our next focus, is to get those 2 categories kicked off and under our belts over the next couple of months. Meet with stakeholders in August and September, and then come back and provide an informational briefing update to the board in September. That update may include also our refinements to category 1 now. Category 4 and 5. 4 is the sort of the programmatic improvement program for small communities. So we do have the 3 communities of Knights Landing, Yolo, and Grimes that are kind of close. They span 2 counties. So this could be a good test case of how an overlaid SSJDD assessment could raise the capital needed for those to defray the cost of individual 218, kind of solve a jurisdictional revenue. So we're going to draft guidelines for that and meet with stakeholders to review and get their feedback on whether that's something that they would be interested in having the board opine and move forward on. The last category, 5. So we'll look at some hypothetical examples, like a typical commercial floodproofing project, or a residential structure elevation project to determine costs. We'll be meeting with local agencies that are, implementing these non-structural programs. Sac County, I think, is one of them. Get a sense of what's the magnitude of property owners that might be interested. and again, draft guidelines for the voluntary assessment program. We'll talk to those local agencies and vet that guideline out to get their buy-in for potential implementation. Schedule for this is kind of along the same line. We've been having some ongoing conversations already. We'll continue those through September. We'll provide an informational briefing in September to the board on these as well, and aim to wrap that up in October. And then Ruth, you were going to take these last slides on kind of our last steps.
Yes, thank you, Scott. So these, we're just covering our implementation plan in the last couple slides. So the goal is to develop an implementation plan through August and October. So we would complete the legal and legislative analysis of the SSJPD authority, develop an outline of modifications to the SSJDD assessment authority to provide practical requirements, and then develop the implementation guidelines. So we would need to outline additional studies required to support the specific activities to be funded by the SSJPD assessment, identify any board actions or approvals and associated timeline, and identify the requirements for property owner approval, and outline an annual assessment administration activity. So that's what would be included in the implementation plan. Ryan, next slide, please. Or Scott, if you're driving still. Thank you. So there will be a report of findings for the feasibility study itself. The implementation plan is a separate effort than the report of findings, but the report of findings will evaluate the feasibility for implementation of each service category. The administrative draft of chapters for staff and stakeholder review will be included. We will have a draft report for the board review in November of 2021. And we will provide an informational briefing or a board workshop to solicit the board's final input. And the final report of findings, report action will be hopefully done by the end of this year. That's what we're shooting for. Next slide, please. So this is our schedule. I think this was shown at our last board meeting during our informational briefing. So we're currently in the third row, developing the methodology and test cases. That's been going on since January and will occur through August of this year, in addition to stakeholder meetings. And we're working on refining the analysis and implementation plan. And we will move forward with drafting the report of findings through October. With additional stakeholder meetings, we're doing that at every process, and a final report, as I said earlier, by the end of this year. And that is the conclusion of our presentation. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much to the team and for all the participants. I know it's a lot, and we anticipated 2 hours, but looks like we went over some time. So thanks for hanging in with us.
Thank you, Ruth. On behalf of the board, I'd just like to thank you and Laura Bird and Scott Brown, Kim Floyd, and Joanna Liu for an excellent presentation. All the details and so on are out there, and we're working hand in hand with the stakeholders. I think as we talk about the changes or improvements to the methodology that were discussed today, to be honest, I think this timeline is going to slip a little bit. We probably shouldn't change that, but in our minds, I think you and the team need to think about a more realistic timetable, because it's more important to get this methodology and these test cases squared away first before we move on with the stakeholders and the board, so that we all feel comfortable we're on the same page. That may take a little bit more time. Kim Floyd probably has an idea of the outreach we do, but you know, the history of this board is that we spend the time doing this. We press on these timetables, because if we don't, it'll never get done. But to be honest, because of the questions raised today and with the stakeholders, I think we're gonna have to use a little bit more time just to make sure all our ducks in a line, so to speak. In any event, give that some thought, and then at our next presentation, let us know what you're thinking about that.
Okay.
But on behalf of the board, I'd just like to say it was an excellent presentation. There's obviously a lot of work that's been done, a lot of outreach has been taking place, and a lot of valuable input. And the board's questions today were excellent, and I think we've accomplished a lot. Any other questions from the board? Comments? Okay, we're on item number 5 at this point, which is adjournment, and without objection, this workshop is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ruth and the team. There's a lot of work. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks,
Good
everybody.
work, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.
You too.